2025, 2027, 2030. These are more than just years. These are the most common predictions on when China could invade Taiwan. They are countdowns to a gamble that could reshape the world as we know it. 2025, when China is finally ready to pull the trigger. 2027, to celebrate the centennial of the People's Liberation Army. 2030, when Taiwan's global significance could fade just enough to tempt a strike. Experts no longer ask if an invasion of Taiwan will occur, they only ask when. But here's the catch. No matter the year, no matter the strategy, the ending looks eerily predictable. China ends in ruins. This is how a Chinese invasion of Taiwan could lead to a collapse, both for the aggressor and the global order. Now, China knows the stakes. That's why it spent decades preparing, pouring billions into its military. Beijing's intentions are clear, but so are the risks. An invasion of Taiwan will be the most complex military operation in modern history. And yet with all the risks laid bare, Beijing refuses to back down. Why? Why cling so tightly to Taiwan despite the dangers? The answer lies in understanding what Taiwan represents to China and why giving up on it is simply not an option. To China, Taiwan isn't just a stretch of land across the strait. It's a scar from history that refuses to fade. Beijing sees Taiwan as a renegade province, a piece of its territory unjustly torn away, and the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, has practically anchored its legitimacy to the idea of reclaiming it. Since the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, Taiwan has stood as a glaring reminder of the CCP's unfinished business. It's the one that got away, a sovereign government and 23 million people who've not only resisted Beijing's control, but thrived in defiance of it. For Xi Jinping, China's president, Taiwan is the essence of his grand vision. National rejuvenation, as he calls it, can't happen without unification. It's a promise that the CCP has dangled in front of its people for decades, a promise that could very well bring the CCP to its knees, but more on that later. For now, let's peel back the layers of this ideological obsession and expose what might truly be driving China's fixation on Taiwan: its economy. You see, Taiwan isn't just some rebellious island defying the Chinese rule. It's an economic powerhouse that could supercharge Beijing's ambitions of overtaking the United States as the dominant global power. Control of Taiwan wouldn't just fulfill a symbolic dream, it would hand China the keys to a treasure trove of resources, industries, and geopolitical leverage. Taiwan's economy consistently ranks near the top 20 in the world. That's quite an achievement for an island nation that occupies less than 14,000 square miles. Taiwan owes this impressive ranking to its exports, which serve as a critical lifeline for global supply chains. Electronics, machinery, chemicals, you name it, it's probably coming from Taiwan. But what makes this island nation invaluable is its stranglehold on the semiconductor industry. This tiny island produces more than 90% of the world's advanced semiconductor chips, essential for everything from smartphones and cars to advanced weapon systems. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, a giant in the field, is the go-to supplier for tech giants like Apple. Its expertise is so rare that only one other company, South Korea's Samsung, can compete at the same level. For China, securing Taiwan's semiconductor industry would mean tightening its grip on the world's tech ecosystem. But the stakes are even higher. Taiwan's location is a gateway to controlling vital export routes in the Pacific, giving Beijing unprecedented leverage over global trade. In other words, invading Taiwan is both about profits and power. Yet Taiwan's trade ties are slipping through China's fingers. Taiwan has started to diversify its trade partners, with exports to China hitting historic lows in 2024. Instead, Taiwan has shifted investments towards the US and Southeast Asia, diluting Beijing's influence. That's probably why China is growing restless to accelerate its timeline. The country's plan for Taiwan isn't merely ideological, it's tactical, calculated, and brazenly ambitious. The 2024 military exercise conducted by the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, is the perfect case study of China's strategy for a Taiwan invasion. With nearly 90 ships deployed, two-thirds of them being PLA Navy warships and one-third of Coast Guard vessels, this exercise represented China's largest maritime mobilization since the Taiwan Strait crisis in 1996. Notably, 53 PLA aircraft sorties were reported on December 10th alone, with 7 crossing Taiwan's centerline in an obvious provocation. The key objective of this military exercise was to simulate a Taiwan blockade. It involved multi-layered maritime walls, one circling Taiwan and another extending east past the first island chain, covering the waters around Japan and the Philippines. This tactic demonstrated China's intent to choke Taiwan's maritime trade routes, while simultaneously signaling its ability to disrupt the broader Pacific supply chain. China also declared 7 temporary reserved airspace zones, some extending roughly 600 miles into the Pacific. This was done to simulate denying foreign forces access to critical airspace. The country's naval activity also ventured farther into the Pacific than previous drills, suggesting the PLA is preparing to project power well beyond Taiwan and deter intervention from US and regional allies. But here's the thing. On paper, this simulation paints a picture of undisputed Chinese dominance, but in reality, achieving these goals in a real-world scenario is nearly impossible. This brings us to the first pillar of China's global ambition, its military strength. An invasion of Taiwan alone holds the potential to unravel the entire structure of China's military power. And this is truly just the beginning. An invasion of Taiwan could shatter more than China's military pillar. It threatens to bring down the entire house of cards, undermining every aspect of China's power and vision for the future. The political control, the global influence, the economic dominance. It could all come crashing down if China decided to invade. Let's start with the military. With Russia outright embarrassing itself in Ukraine, China is now widely regarded as the second strongest military in the world, trailing only after the US, and truthfully, there's some merit to this claim. In 2024, China ranked first in the world based on the number of active duty soldiers. It has more than 2 million. That's almost 10 times more than Taiwan's 215,000-strong army. Besides the sheer size of China's armed forces, its expanding technological edge and its growing presence in key military sectors all point to a nation that's making enormous strides in projecting power. Take the Chinese Navy as an example. The PLA Navy became the second largest in the world by tonnage and has produced some truly ambitious naval assets. It's safe to say that these naval assets are a direct challenge to Western influence in the Indo-Pacific region. With a fleet that includes cutting-edge vessels such as the Fujian aircraft carrier and the Type 076 amphibious assault ship, China is laying the groundwork for an unprecedented capacity to project military force, particularly in regions like Taiwan. The Fujian, China's most advanced aircraft carrier, is a notable achievement in its own right. Displacing 88,000 tons, it's far more advanced than China's earlier carriers and rivals American and British designs. Its electromagnetic catapult system, likely derived from industrial espionage, makes it one of the most modern carriers outside the Western world, capable of launching heavier, more advanced aircraft. Meanwhile, the Type 076 hybrid amphibious assault ship, the largest of its kind in the world, combines elements of a traditional amphibious vessel with those of an aircraft carrier. This hybrid ship, with a displacement of around 50,000 tons, is not only a formidable force for amphibious landings, but also significantly boosts China's ability to project air power. Its electromagnetic launch system is a game-changer, enabling the launch of both drones and fighter jets. These assets make China a serious player in the Indo-Pacific, no doubt. But here's the catch. No matter how stacked the deck is, an invasion of Taiwan is doomed. It's one thing to flex power, it's another to execute an invasion on the world stage. And in Taiwan, everything is working against China. There's no exaggeration here. Launching a full-scale amphibious invasion of Taiwan would require a Herculean logistical effort, dwarfing even the massive scale of the D-Day operation during World War II. The Chinese military would have to deploy and sustain hundreds of thousands of troops, along with massive amounts of military hardware, supplies, and equipment, to have any chance to overcome Taiwan's formidable defenses. Let's talk numbers. Foreign analysts estimate that China would attempt to land up to 400,000 soldiers across several beaches and potentially airfields. For comparison, D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history, saw the successful landing of around 130,000 Allied troops in just one day. The PLA would need a much larger force, facing the challenges of more difficult terrain, stronger defenses, and a smaller window for success. Some estimates even put the number of troops necessary for a successful invasion at 2 million. Yep, you heard that right. That's more soldiers than most countries even have in their ranks. The scale of the transport operation required would be simply staggering. Moving 30 million tons of supplies across the 100-mile-wide Taiwan Strait and onto Taiwan's shores would exceed the capacity of China's amphibious transport fleet. Although China is supplementing its military vessels with civilian roll-on, roll-off ferries, which it plans to double or triple in number by 2032, the challenge of moving such massive quantities of material within a short window is still enormous. These ferries take longer to unload than military vessels and are much more vulnerable to Taiwanese missile strikes. The same goes for specialized landing ships China is developing. These barge-like vessels with extendable ramps might be capable of crossing shallow mudflats and unloading tanks, but they are still vulnerable to enemy fire. That's why their construction, while a step forward, doesn't solve the problem of delivering heavy military equipment rapidly, especially in rough sea conditions. Civilian ships would also be required to fill the gap. However, the largest exercises testing this capability have only involved a modest 24 civilian ships, a far cry from the thousands that would be needed for a full-scale invasion. Moreover, civilian vessels are also slower to unload, leaving them vulnerable as well. With the ships vulnerable and unable to approach too close to the coast, Taiwan could target them from a distance, potentially sinking or severely damaging a significant portion of the fleet before it could even reach the shore. Taiwan's mobile missile launchers, minefields, and other anti-landing defenses could further complicate matters for the PLA. To make matters even worse for China, even Mother Nature is on Taiwan's side. The Taiwan coastline is a treacherous maze for invaders. Cliffs that tower over the shore, mudflats that could swallow just about everything, and tightly packed urban zones. They all form a giant trap designed to slow down or outright destroy any attempt to land. And with only a handful of suitable landing zones, each one would quickly become a kill zone, perfectly set up for Taiwan's defenders to make their stand. Then there's the weather. The Taiwan Strait isn't some placid body of water. It's a raging, unpredictable beast, heavily influenced by the Asian monsoon system. Tropical storms are a regular threat, and climate change is making them even fiercer. China might try to time its invasion, but the weather doesn't play by anyone's schedule. One misstep in timing and an entire invasion fleet could be swallowed by waves, with crucial transport vessels sinking beneath the sea. Even when the weather cooperates, strong winds and rough seas could turn a carefully planned assault into a logistical disaster. Simply put, the invaders will be at the mercy of the elements. But even if you take the weather out of the question, the execution of such a large-scale amphibious assault would quickly become a nightmare. Just imagine trying to synchronize thousands of ships, planes, and soldiers, each with its own mission, but all needing to move in perfect unison. China's largest amphibious drills have only involved a fraction of the forces required for an actual invasion. That's why the real-life coordination complexity alone could bring the operation to a screeching halt. And it's not just about moving ships across the Taiwan Strait. China would have to coordinate military and civilian vessels, ensuring that soldiers and equipment hit the beaches at the same time while under heavy fire, while also dealing with the chaos of enemy missiles, airstrikes, and sabotage. This is a scale and intensity China's joint operations have never faced. Their military hasn't been tested in anything approaching the level of modern warfare required for this type of operation. Then there's Taiwan's defense. The island nation has fortified its beaches with anti-landing mines, anti-ship missiles, and spike barriers that would make any large-scale landing feel like a death sentence. In some places, the beaches are so rugged, the terrain so imposing, that an invading force would struggle to just get a foothold, let alone advance. Even if China could successfully land a force on Taiwan's beaches, the next massive challenge would be securing the island. Key cities, military bases, and industrial zones would need to be taken and held, a task that could take weeks or even months. The resistance from Taiwan's forces would be fierce, with every inch of ground bitterly contested. Such a prolonged engagement would stretch China's resources to their limits. The initial blitzkrieg strategy would quickly turn into an exhausting grind, forcing China to reevaluate its strategic priorities. Any delay or failure could trigger wider international involvement, escalating into a conflict that China is simply not prepared for. This involvement would almost certainly be led by the US. The US Pacific Fleet, the largest and most powerful naval force in the world, is always on standby. 200 ships, 1,500 aircraft, and 150,000 personnel poised to destroy any invading force. The US can strike from thousands of miles away with precision weapons, turning the entire invasion fleet into sitting ducks. If China thought it could push through unchallenged, they'd be sorely mistaken. On top of that, the US isn't alone. It's backed by Japan, South Korea, and Australia, who would likely provide a range of support from military intervention to intelligence and logistical backing. Any move by China would immediately trigger a regional response, escalating the situation far beyond what China could handle. And just like that, the world's second largest military power would crumble. And it wouldn't be by the overwhelming force of an external enemy. No, just miscalculations and the unforgiving realities of geography, logistics, and sheer willpower. But the fall of China wouldn't stop there. Next up, the first cracks in political control. Remember what we told you? For decades, the unification with Taiwan had been not just a goal but an obsession. From Mao Zedong to Xi, the message was always very clear. The island would eventually be reclaimed. The CCP had spent years building this narrative, this sacred duty, and the failure to deliver would be catastrophic. It would tear at the very fabric of the party's legitimacy and bring an existential crisis for Xi and his comrades. China's political system, built on absolute control, would struggle to spin this into anything resembling a win. The CCP could simply not afford to admit defeat. Instead, the narrative would shift to a desperate attempt to save face, claiming a strategic victory, but no amount of propaganda would disguise the stark reality. Then the economic impact would hit like a wrecking ball. Bloomberg Economics had already estimated that a full-scale war over Taiwan could deal China a massive blow, a 16.7% blow to its GDP to be precise. Such a loss could cripple the Chinese economy for decades to come. The toll would come not just from the destruction of military assets, but from the war's cascading effects on trade, investment, and global supply chains. In a matter of months, China could go from an economic powerhouse to a crippled giant. Even if China managed to pull off a blockade of Taiwan, the cost would be too high to bear. In the first year alone, China's economy would face an estimated 8.9% decline in GDP. And yet the full extent of the damage wouldn't just be economic. The CCP's ability to project influence on the global stage would also be shattered. Once seen as an emerging superpower capable of bending global markets to its will, China would be locked into an isolated, hostile standoff with the West. Its Belt and Road Initiative, which had been an ambitious symbol of China's global reach, would become nothing but a relic. The world would simply turn its back on China. And for China, the global consequences would be just the beginning of an internal struggle. Politicians and generals would point fingers, trying to shift blame. Ordinary citizens, disillusioned by years of empty promises, might begin to question the very foundation of CCP rule. Would Xi survive this humiliation? Could he maintain control over a fractured party? Could the CCP preserve its grip on power, or would the people demand something else, a reckoning? There are just so many questions, and none of the answers appear promising for China. In the wake of military failure, economic collapse, and global upheaval, China's political system would be pushed to the breaking point, the last standing pillar of China's power. The immense toll of the war would create an opportunity for dissent, underground movements, rival factions within the party, and a populace desperate for answers. It's only a question of who would have a go first. But the fall of China's political control wouldn't be swift, it would be slow and agonizing. However, the same can't be said for the impact the Chinese invasion of Taiwan would have on the world. Sure, the invasion would wreck China, but the world wouldn't exactly escape unscathed. After all, we've seen how much damage a few months of pandemic lockdowns did to the global economy, right? Now imagine the entire world's supply chains grinding to a halt because China decides to stage the most costly and aggressive land grab of the 21st century. So exactly how costly would this invasion be? We're talking about $10 trillion of global economic carnage, or about 10% of global GDP, as Bloomberg Economics calculated. That's potentially a greater economic blow than the war in Ukraine, the COVID-19 pandemic, or the 2008 financial crisis individually. If you were already feeling the effects of inflation, this could turn the dial up to 11. The impact would be catastrophic, even without China fully seizing Taiwan. A year-long Chinese blockade would trigger a massive 12.2% blow to Taiwan's GDP in the first year alone. And the US economy? If drawn into the conflict, it could lose 6.7% of its GDP. But the economic disaster is just the beginning. The geopolitical fallout of China's invasion could be nothing short of catastrophic. Countries like India and Vietnam, who have long held grievances with Beijing over territorial disputes, would likely see this as their moment to strike. The surrounding region would explode into an arms race as nations prepare for the next possible Chinese move. Global trade routes would also shift dramatically. The Luzon Strait, a narrow passage between Taiwan and the Philippines, could become the new geopolitical choke point. Countries dependent on China's maritime control would suddenly find their economic lifelines severed, pushing Japan and South Korea into deeper alignments with the West. The entire regional security architecture would change as nations formed new coalitions and diplomatic pacts to counter Beijing's now revealed vulnerabilities. And let's not forget the tech apocalypse. In a world where nearly every electronic system is powered by semiconductors, an invasion would trigger a global electronic shutdown. From your smartphones to military defense systems, air conditioners, fridges, cars, everything is interconnected, and everything would suffer. The knock-on effects on healthcare, agriculture, and communications could be felt across continents. Countries would struggle to maintain basic services. People would have to relearn how to function in a world without the technologies they've become so dependent on. So what would happen if China attempted the impossible? A complete and utter collapse. That's what. And with it, a new world order would begin to take shape, one that could signal the end of China's dream of dominance and the birth of a more fragmented global landscape. Do you agree, or do you see China's invasion of Taiwan playing out differently? Share your predictions in the comments section below. Now go and check out The Second China Moves on Taiwan, the Trap Will Spring Shut, or click this other video instead.